morning. It's good to be back here. Just a couple of months ago, on October 7th, we all saw the news of Hamas attacking Israel. And there's been a lot of discussion arising from that about biblical prophecy and about the coming of the Lord. In fact, that happens every time, it seems, that there's some huge conflict in the world, and especially if that conflict happens in connection with the state of Israel. Let's see what was on your mind with the choice of the passage that you read from Galatians chapter 2, an appropriate passage to keep in mind. But one of the passages that, and one of the thoughts of so many people today is to turn to passages, for example, Matthew chapter 24, and to apply things from that passage to events today and say that those events are what is being spoken of in Matthew chapter 24 or other passages. The people will also appeal to passages in Daniel or Zechariah or the book of Revelation, and we won't be looking at those today. We'll just be looking at Matthew chapter 24. I believe Matthew chapter 24 is talking, and I've already gotten behind on my slides. I want to show you quickly some things that I found on the internet, current images that people have, where they're evidencing their connection between these events and biblical prophecy. First one, prophecy update, Israel at war on the brink of end times. Second one, is Israel versus Hamas, the start of World War III and the end times. All things Israel and Hamas, and end times prophecy. 2023, end time Bible prophecy, Israel war. So making all of these connections and saying that these things are the events we're seeing today are connected with biblical prophecy about the end of time. And I don't think that's the right way to understand these passages. I don't think it's the right way to understand Matthew chapter 24. I believe Matthew chapter 24 is talking about two things. The first section is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire, the Roman armies, came to Israel to suppress uprisings there, to suppress resentment against Rome, destroy Jerusalem, destroyed in particular the temple in Jerusalem. And Jesus talked about that, especially in this passage and in the close of the chapter before it. Then we get to the second section of Matthew chapter 24. I believe Jesus shifts and is talking about the end time, but he's not giving any signs that we would be able to read and say, oh, the end is near. So we'll take a look at this, and we'll just kind of work our way through Matthew chapter 24. And first of all, I want to just notice, just so we're kind of aware of the setting in which these remarks are made. And so let's notice the first three verses of Matthew chapter 24. And Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So let's notice where they've come from and where they end up at for the rest of this discussion here in Matthew chapter 24. Verse 1 says that they are coming out of the temple and going away. And in verse 3, And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. So, as you can see here, this is Jerusalem. This is the temple courtyard. This is the temple itself. This is the Mount of Olives. So they've come out of the temple. Most images I see of first century Jerusalem don't have this bridge. Perhaps it was there, and I've just been unaware of that. Of course, this is just a drawing of someone's understanding of the city, and most of this is pretty accurate. I was just a little surprised with this. I wasn't aware that that was there. So they're walking out of the temple and coming up to the Mount of Olives, and that's where this discussion happens. If we look in verse 2, he answered and said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another." And I should have mentioned before that, just to highlight again what they're doing in verse 1. They're pointing out from this vantage point as they're walking away and walking up this mountain. They're looking back at the temple and pointing out these beautiful buildings of the temple, the architecture and all of that. And Jesus says in verse 2, "Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which won't be torn down." And I want to connect this back to chapter 23. In chapter 23, Jesus speaks to the multitudes, and he speaks especially and most directly to the scribes and the Pharisees and those who have rejected his message, those who've rejected him. And so he's pronouncing woes on those people. And for example, we see in verses 5 through 7 how he's talking about how the scribes and the Pharisees, they love to be seen. They love for people to notice how holy and special they are. Verse 6, they love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called by men rabbi. In verse 13, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men." Verse 14, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses." Verse 15, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel about on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." Verse 16, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated." Verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Just again and again. Verse 25, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." Verse 27, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." Verse 29, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, 'Oh, if we'd been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding blood of the prophets.'" Verse 31, I want us to notice a little more carefully the rest of this passage. "Consequently, you bear witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify, and some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." I want to comment briefly on this comment of the Lord, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah. In our Bibles and in Hebrew Bibles, Abel is there in Genesis chapter 4, the first one killed for doing what was good and right. In our Bibles, the Old Testament ends with Malachi, but in the Hebrew scriptures, it was reordered. Well, no, we've reordered it. Their original order had 2 Chronicles as the final book of the Old Testament, and books like Malachi came a little earlier than that in the order of their books. And so in their Bibles, in 2 Chronicles, when Zechariah, not the same Zechariah as the prophet, Zechariah is the final one killed for doing what is good and what is right. And so the Lord is saying here in verse 35, from the beginning of Old Testament history to the end of Old Testament history, from Abel to Zechariah, the guilt of all of that is going to come down in the generation he was speaking to. And he says in verse 36, truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation. I imagine Jesus' tone changes in verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Your house is being left to you desolate. Now, house could mean different things. We read about the house of David, for example, and that means kind of all the kings that followed that were descendants of David. But house also refers to the temple of God. That's the house of God. But I kind of think here that Jesus is saying it's not God's house anymore because of how unfaithful the Jews have been. And so he says, your house is being left to you desolate. Your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's on the heels of all of those woes he is pronouncing on the Jews of the first century. And on the heels of him saying, your house is being left to you desolate, that the disciples are pointing out the buildings of the temple. And Jesus says it's all going to be torn down. Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Chapter 24, verse 2. And then in verse 3, and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I included just a few more images in this introduction. So you have an image there, a sense there of them leaving the temple and going up here, and the view back to the temple. This is the view today from the Mount of Olives, and you can see here the outline of the wall. I think most of this wall is built more recently than the first century, but it's in the same location where that ancient wall was. And you can see here, this is called the Dome of the Rock. It's an Islamic mosque that was built roughly on the same location that the temple itself was built. And so if we look at this next image, it's viewed almost from the same angle. This is a model of Jerusalem in the first century that you can see if you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Holy Land Motel or Hotel. And they have this model out back. You can get a, I've cropped it out. In one of my images, I think it was this image, you can see a man standing next to this. But you can get a sense of the scale. Well, there's a door, for example. There's a door. And that gives you a sense of the scale of this model. And you can see buildings in the background. But this is what they would have been looking back at as they left Jerusalem, up the Mount of Olives, and then looking back at Jerusalem and pointing out the beautiful buildings of the temple. You have the temple wall, you have the temple itself, and that's what Jesus says it's all going to be destroyed. As he says again, as we notice again, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. I think that's all. Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment. So then they ask their question. When Jesus says it's all going to be torn down, verse 3, and as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So when will these things be? What are they talking about when they say, when will these things be? Well, what he just said about the temple being destroyed, about not one stone being left upon another. So they're asking, when will that happen? When will the temple be destroyed? They continue, and what will be the sign of your coming? So they're wanting to know, will we be able to know when that's going to happen? Will there be signs? What will be the signs that that's about to happen? And then the third way they phrase this is, and of the end of the age. What will be the sign of the end of the age? That word age, and your translations may say the end of the world. It's a word, world or age. It's a Greek word that could mean kind of either thing. The end of an age of things, the end of the world. And so it's a little bit ambiguous to us exactly what they meant when they asked this. But maybe it's fitting that while they may think they're asking one question, that these things, the destruction of the temple and the end of the age, the end of the world, they may think that's one question. But if they're asking the end of the world, Jesus realizes that's two questions. When will the temple be destroyed? And when will be the end of the world? And Jesus answers both of those in Matthew 24. He discusses, as we've already mentioned, the first section of the chapter about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And then in the next section of the chapter, the end of the world. So let's work our way through this chapter. We won't comment on every part, but we will read each part of this chapter. And remember the question that Jesus is answering. Most immediately, their question is, when will these stones be torn down? When will the temple be destroyed? So, let me go ahead and put my next slide. And this is really my final slide. The slideshow is kind of over at this point with this one final slide that kind of outlines the rest of our discussion. They've asked their question. In verse 4, Jesus begins to respond. We're going to read verses 4 through 15. And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. That's an important principle. Because these are things that ever since that day, people have been misleading people about. See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Has there been a time in history when there haven't been wars and rumors of wars? It's kind of constant. Now, a particular nation may go for some years without a war, and yes, that happens, but even then we hear about wars happening in other places. Wars are kind of constant. And Jesus says you'll hear about wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened. These things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you. Jesus says, then they will deliver you. He's talking to those men in the first century. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. Most of the apostles died a martyr's death. And you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. And at that time, many will fall away and will deliver up one another and hate one another. Jesus says you'll see people turning on each other, turning one another in, reporting on others, rather than standing for what was good and right. And many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, and because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. People are constantly applying verses like this, the verses before this and this, to see. We look around us today. There's wars and rumors of wars, and people's love grows cold. Jesus must be talking about today. Those things happen all the time. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. But which end? The end of the world? Or what their initial question is? When will these things happen? When will those stones be knocked down and not one left on another? Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, Matthew adds as a parenthetical statement there. Then let all those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So let's comment on this abomination of desolation. That is quotation from Daniel. Daniel is talking about events between his day and Jesus' day. And this seems to be an indication from Daniel about events that happened about 170 years before the time of Jesus, when the Greek ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, came to Jerusalem, besieged Jerusalem, attacked the temple, and cut off the sacrifices that the Israelites would normally be making, and himself set up an altar to Zeus, or an idol of Zeus, in the temple, and then sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. Obviously, the idol of Zeus should not be put in the place, the presence of God in the temple. And obviously, a pig should not be sacrificed on the altar. Pigs were unclean, according to the law of Moses. It's not unlike, sometimes you'll hear about people in wars in the Middle East talking about dipping bullets in pig's blood that they want to shoot Muslims with, to desecrate them, to make them unclean in their own view. That's kind of what Antiochus Epiphanes did, bringing a pig to sacrifice on the altar of the Israelites, the altar of God. So that was the abomination of desolation that Daniel was talking about. That happened about 170 years before Jesus. Jesus uses that image to say that apparently something similar was going to happen in the not too distant future. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through the Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, parentheses, Matthew adds, let the reader understand. So Jesus is using this as a comparison. Matthew wants his people to understand what Jesus is talking about. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to get the things out that are in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. Jesus is talking about a local judgment in this passage. Not the end of days when everything's going to be destroyed and the Lord's going to return, but a local judgment in Jerusalem that you could escape from by leaving the city. That's why he says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down and get the things out that are in the house. You know, you're on the housetop and you see the Roman army coming. Don't just go downstairs and start packing. Get out. Verse, where's my place here? Verse 18, and let him who is in the field, so you know, the fields are out of the city. You're already out of Jerusalem, working in the field. Jesus says, don't go back into the city to get your coat. Just go. This is a local judgment in that place that they can escape from. Verse 20. But pray that your flight may not be in the winter. Because, you know, you're going to have to just get out immediately without taking time to gather things. So, you know, hope it's not in the winter. Pray that your flight may not be on a Sabbath. Because the Pharisees had instituted this rule about not being able to travel farther than some certain distance. And it was fairly short. Because they said that would be working on the Sabbath. And so Jesus says, pray that it's not on the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation. That's what people so often interpret as end time language. But it was just end time for Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you in advance. If therefore they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go forth, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. The messages, don't worry about people saying those kind of things. It's just when you see the Roman army coming, when you see something terrible, abominable happening in the temple, that's the time to get out of the city, because that destruction is about to happen. Verse 27, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. This is common language from Old Testament prophecy. Prophecies of nations in that time period being judged by God. We look at these verses, and if we're not familiar with that Old Testament language, and we read about the sun being darkened and the moon will not shed its light, and stars will fall from the sky, and we think, well, that hasn't happened yet. Stars haven't fallen from the sky. And so this is talking about some cataclysmic, cosmic event that's got to be talking about the end. No. This is common language in the prophets of the Old Testament. We won't take time in this lesson to go back and see those, but this language was often used for prophecies of nations in that time period being judged. Stars falling from heaven is often used to refer to rulers of nations falling from their powerful positions. And then, verse 30, the sign of the Son of Man, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Yes, this sounds like he could be talking about the end time. Stay with me. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. He says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. when its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Okay, what's that about? Jesus is just saying, you know how to recognize signs. You know when you see a fig tree and it puts out fresh, tender stems and branches and leaves, you can see that sign and know summer's near. At the two corners of my front house, there are two trees. I'm not even sure what kind of trees they are, but they're the first thing to bloom when spring is approaching. I see the blossoms coming on those two trees, and I know, okay, winter is finally about over, and it's about to be spring. Jesus is just saying in this verse, you see the fig tree, fresh new branches and leaves, you know that you can read that sign. Verse 33, even so you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Everything he's said so far falls under this statement in verse 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So what we've read so far is not talking about the end time that's still in our future. It's talking about events that would happen during that generation. And this is connected back to the end of chapter 23, and it's part of the reason I wanted to include the end of chapter 23, when he says about the guilt that's going to come on that generation because of the hypocritical scribes and Pharisees and how they had rejected the Lord. Jesus says to them at the close of that chapter, truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation. And it's the same thing into the first section of Matthew chapter 24. So whenever somebody points to something in the first half of chapter 24, whether it's talking about the abomination of desolation, or their flight, or the sun being darkened and the stars falling from the sky, the sign of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky, all of those things. When somebody points to that and says, yeah, we're seeing that now, remind them of verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. I want to emphasize that in this section of the chapter, Jesus has been talking about signs. When you see this, when you see that, then get out of the city. He says you're able to recognize signs. You see the fig trees and you're able to see that as a sign that summer is near. So then when you see these things, recognize that the Lord is near. He's about to come in judgment of Jerusalem. Well, having looked at that part of this discussion in Matthew chapter 24, in the first section of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus wants to emphasize how sure and certain his statement is that those things will happen, that those events will happen. How certain it was that temple is going to be destroyed. And so he says in verse 35, right after he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Let's talk about that verse for a moment. How sure is Jesus' word? Might Jesus' message about all of this kind of pass away and fizzle out and not really happen? No. Heaven and earth are pretty stable things, right? Yeah. Heaven and earth are pretty stable things. But Jesus says, even heaven and earth are going to pass away someday. Even something as stable as heaven and earth will someday pass away, but my word is more stable than even heaven and earth. My word will not pass away. My word will not fail. What I've been telling you will happen, Jesus is saying. So he's mentioned heaven and earth passing away as a way to illustrate that Jesus' word is even more stable than heaven and earth, which is pretty stable, but even it will fail. Jesus' word is more stable and will not fail. But now Jesus has introduced a second topic. He's been talking about when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And now as an illustration, he's mentioned the idea of heaven and earth passing away. And I think that's where a shift happens in Jesus' discussion in this chapter, that now Jesus begins to talk about, yes, the end of time when heaven and earth will pass away. Again, verse 35. I haven't looked at my notes much in the last few minutes. Let me make sure I'm not missing something I want to mention. So Jesus finishes that first part of the discussion, makes a shift. He's been talking about signs, and so you'll know when Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. After this shift, when he begins to talk about when heaven and earth pass away, he's not talking about signs anymore. In fact, he's saying there won't be a sign for you to know when heaven and earth will pass away. First half of the chapter, there'll be signs, you will know. The next section of the chapter, there won't be any signs, you won't know. So he's got to be talking about two different things. The first part of the chapter, destruction of Jerusalem. The next part of the chapter, the end of time, the end of the world. So, from verse 35 on, from verse 36 on, I think he is talking about the end of the world. But he's saying you won't know when it's going to happen. So all these people who look at current events, and for example, the war in Israel right now, and saying, it's a sign of the end times. No, when Jesus gets to talking about actual end times in Matthew chapter 24, his message is, you won't know. There will not be signs. So Matthew 24, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Verse 36, but of that day and hour, when heaven and earth pass away, no one knows. For even, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man, when heaven and earth will be destroyed, for the coming of the Son of Man will be like the days of Noah. For as in those days, which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage, and the day that Noah, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. When the Son of Man comes, at the time when heaven and earth will be destroyed, it'll be like in the days of Noah. Nobody's expecting it. The people who lived in Noah's days were not expecting there to be an actual flood. And suddenly it came and took them all away. Verse 40. Then there shall be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this. Here's an illustration about something that happens and you had no warning about it because there weren't any signs about it, and so you didn't know it was going to happen that night. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. I don't know if any of you have had your houses broken into. I had mine broken into one time. It's hard to say broken into because it's unlocked. But I wasn't there, and someone came in and stole a couple of things from me. And I didn't know that that was going to happen. I knew it was possible, but I didn't think it was likely, which is why I didn't lock the doors. If I had known that he was coming that day, I would have been there, and I wouldn't have let him in. But I had no signs. I had no indications that that was about to happen. So I didn't take care about it. Be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you be ready too. For the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not think he will. Again, first section of Matthew chapter 24, there will be signs. You'll be able to see some things. You'll be able to read those events, and you'll be able to know it's about to happen, so get out of Jerusalem. The next section of the chapter, he's not talking about Jerusalem anymore. He's talking about something different. He says, you won't know when it's going to happen. It'll be like when the thief shows up at your house. You had no indication that that was about to happen. So you weren't ready. And Jesus is saying, so what you need to do is be ready all the time. That's the message I needed for my house. I should have been ready all the time. Should have kept it locked. And that thief would not have gotten in and stolen what he stole. For this reason you be ready too, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not think he will. Who then? And now we're going to get into some lessons from this. I want to make one final statement about these two sections of Matthew chapter 24 up until this point. The first part of the chapter about the destruction of the temple, there were going to be signs. The rest of the chapter about the end of heavens and earth, when they pass away, there are no signs. So when we look at Israel today, and we see a war happening in Israel, that is not a sign about the end of times. Because Jesus is saying in this part of the chapter, there won't be any signs. You won't know. It's going to happen like the thief comes. You don't know when he's going to come. No man knows. Not the angels, not the Son. Only the Father. Now, as we get toward the end of our lesson, the following passages are some lessons to be drawn from this. Beginning in verse 45. Who then, in light of the fact that Jesus is going to come again yet in our future, when heaven and earth will be destroyed, who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and he shall begin to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and shall cut him in pieces, and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there, and the gnashing of teeth. So there's a lesson we take from this fact, that when Jesus comes again yet in our future, when heaven and earth will be destroyed, we don't know when that's going to be. So we need to be faithful all the time and live right all the time. And then you have this passage in the first part of Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the foolish virgins and the wise virgins. They're waiting for a wedding feast, and some of them have not brought oil for their lamps. They didn't prepare. They weren't ready. And then the bridegroom comes, and they miss out on the wedding feast because they weren't living in preparation for it. Well, there's a lesson for us about always being prepared and living with faith as we ought to live, being ready for the coming of our Lord whenever it may happen. Then in the next section of Matthew chapter 25, we have the parable of the talents. And right after that, we have this passage beginning in Matthew 25, verse 31. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of those brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." Then he will also say to those on his left, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his enemies. For I was hungry, you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." And they start asking, "Oh Lord, when did we see you sick? When did we see you without food and fail you?" Verse 45, then he will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, that to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." So Jesus, in the first section of Matthew 24, is talking about the time when those buildings of the temple, the ones that from the Mount of Olives the disciples had looked back and were pointing out to Jesus. And Jesus responded, "It's all going to be torn down." That first section of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is talking about that time. But there's a shift. He begins to talk about when heaven and earth will pass away, the actual end time. And there won't be signs for that. No one will know that it's about to happen. And Jesus says you just need to be prepared all the time. You need to serve others the way you would serve me if I needed your help. And then this final statement in verse 46 about that end time when heaven and earth will pass away, the time of the final judgment, when some will go away into eternal punishment and the righteous into eternal life. So we need to be ready. I hope these thoughts are helpful to you about Matthew 24 and current events, and how time after time people have looked at current events and tried to associate them with the end time. That's making a connection that Jesus says you can't make, because there won't be a sign of the end time. I hope that's been helpful to you. But also I hope this last part of the discussion about being ready all the time, living with faith all the time, being like the wise virgins who were ready for the bridegroom to come.